Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Solar plus Storage for All in Connecticut, a framework for deployment in low-income and disadvantaged communities. This is the fourth and final webinar in our Spotlight on Residential Solar in Connecticut webinar series. My name is Rudy Stirk, the Associate Director of Marketing and Communications at the Green Bank. And before we start, I just wanted to cover a couple of quick housekeeping items before we get into the presentation. First, today's webinar is being recorded. We will send out a link to the recording when it's posted, along with some other related materials. Second, we will have some time at the end of the presentation for questions. So please put any questions you might have during the presentation into the question box on the GoToWebinar panel, and we will do our best to answer them at the end. If we don't get to all the questions at the end, we will do our best to follow up with you directly and answer those questions. So please do enter those as we go throughout the presentation. For today, we have Brian Garcia, President and CEO of the Green Bank, along with Josh Ryer, Managing Director at Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, better known as PURA, and Sergio Carrillo, Managing Director at the Connecticut Green Bank. So without further delay, I'll turn this over to Brian Garcia.
All right, thank you, Rudy. I wanted to start off by welcoming all of our webinar attendees today. You are local Connecticut stakeholders that are interested in residential solar and storage. You're also states and municipalities across the country interested in learning more about residential solar incentives and financing programs, as well as battery storage. As a follow-up from our last three webinars, where we discussed in the first webinar a 10-year residential solar incentive program that we implemented here in Connecticut. The second webinar was on residential solar loans, and the third webinar was on residential solar power purchase agreements and lease programs. Today, we're going to talk about Connecticut's new residential incentive programs for solar PV and energy storage, relatively new. We launched them in 2022, as well as a few other programs that may be of interest to you. So why don't we get started? Let's go to the next slide. So the Connecticut Green Bank is the nation's first state-level green bank. We're a quasi-public organization, which means that we get to use private sector disciplines to achieve public sector goals. We're an intermediary between the ambitious public policy objectives of the state and the need to attract private capital investment into those markets to achieve those public policies. Our mission is to confront climate change, and we do that by increasing and accelerating investment into our state's growing green economy. Investment is the key input into that system, and we do it to create more resilient, healthier, and equitable communities. More investment in clean energy and environmental infrastructure deployment creates the social and environmental outputs and outcomes that government is after. Since our founding in July of 2011, we've invested $360 million of public resources to mobilize nearly $2.1 billion of private investment. That's resulted in the deployment of over 570 megawatts of clean energy and nearly 70 million MMBTUs of energy efficiency savings. This reduced the energy costs on nearly 70,000 families and businesses, especially those in vulnerable communities. Supported the creation of over 27,000 direct, indirect, and induced jobs in our communities. It's helped raise tax revenues, nearly $130 million in sales, personal, corporate, and property tax revenues for the state. Of course, it's helped avoid greenhouse gas emissions, over 11 million metric tons from those systems. And as we reduce GHGs, we also reduce air pollution. And as we reduce air pollution, we improve public health because we reduce public health care costs. And in doing all of that, we make the green economy more accessible and affordable to vulnerable communities, low to moderate income families and communities of color, and helping them combat energy inflation by reducing energy consumption and choosing clean, renewable energy instead of fossil fuels. Next slide. On August 16th of last year, nearly a year ago, or just over a year ago, President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act into law. As we're all beginning to see, the IRA is the largest investment from the US government ever in the modernization and decarbonization of our nation's energy infrastructure. Beyond the IRA seeking to achieve a zero carbon electric sector by 2035 and carbon neutral economy by 2050, it puts Justice 40 and just transition right alongside reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We see this in the investment tax credit requirements for prevailing wages and apprenticeships in order to receive the full 30%. We see this in the adders to that tax credit for energy communities that can receive an additional 10%, low-income households and tribal communities that can receive an additional 10 to 20%, and Made in America domestic content provisions that can receive an additional 10%. There are locations here in Connecticut that have the potential to receive up to 70% from the investment tax credit. And then, of course, there is the $27 billion Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund administered by the EPA. Next slide. Within the IRA, and specifically Section 134A of the Clean Air Act, is the inclusion of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. The EPA has released all three notices of funding opportunities, and October 12th is the deadline for submission for all of those competitions. Many of us have been working hard all summer on these applications. I'm going to call this summer of 2023 the summer of GGRF. The Connecticut Green Bank is working with the American Green Bank Consortium and other partners on the $14 billion National Clean Investment Fund, which to many is the national climate bank policy that the Coalition for Green Capital has been working on for more than a decade. We're also working with community lenders, community development financial institutions, credit unions, housing agencies, and others on the $6 billion Clean Communities Investment Accelerator. Today's webinar is related to our focus on the $7 billion Solar for All competition with the focus on residential solar and associated storage. Next slide. This is the competition for up to 60 awards to states, including territories like Puerto Rico, tribal governments, municipalities, and other nonprofits to invest $7 billion through technical assistance, things like data collection, program implementation services, stakeholder engagement, where no more than 25% of the request for funds can come from. And secondly, financial assistance, subgrants, incentive payments, loans, where more than 75% of the request for funds must come from. The use of these proceeds is for the zero emission technologies that are being specified by the EPA as residential solar, community solar, associated storage, and enabling upgrades, which now includes energy efficiency. The important objectives for the EPA are to first reduce greenhouse gas emissions and other air pollutants. Second, to deliver benefits to American communities, particularly low-income and disadvantaged communities. And third, to mobilize financing and private capital to stimulate additional deployment of such projects. These objectives are the Connecticut Green Bank's objectives as well. We have 1 month since yesterday to submit a winning application on behalf of the Connecticut Consortium led by the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, and including the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, the Connecticut Department of Housing, the Connecticut Housing and Finance Authority, and the Green Bank. Next slide. So we'd invite all of you to learn more about the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund by visiting the EPA's website. All right, so having done some of that background, I want to now introduce Josh Ryer, Managing Director at the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, PURA, to work us through residential renewable energy solutions. Josh.
Great, thanks so much, Brian, and thank you to the Green Bank for the invitation to present here today. So as Brian mentioned, I want to talk about in the Residential Renewable Energy Solutions program today. And I want to start off by giving a high-level overview of the program and provide a little bit of context on where we started with the program and what our objectives are. So as Brian mentioned, the Residential Renewable Energy Solutions Program, or RRES for short, began last year on January 1st of 2022, and it's actually statutorily authorized to be a 6-year program. The program, unlike the previous programs, which I'll get into a second, is directly administered by the electric distribution companies, the investor-owned electric distribution companies in Connecticut, which are Eversource and United Illuminating. And that's actually where, just for some context, where PURA's role comes in, because PURA regulates the electric utilities, and this is a program that's administered by the utilities, we have oversight over this program. As I mentioned, this program replaced the legacy programs that we had in place prior to January 1st of 2022, which was traditional net metering, which you might be familiar with, and the residential solar investment program, which was very successfully administered by the Green Bank. And what's important to note about those programs is legacy net metering compensated owners of residential solar for the energy that is produced from those systems, and the residential solar investment program provided upfront or performance-based incentives for the renewable energy attributes of the system. Additional information or details on the program are below on the slide there. This program is for any projects up to 25 kilowatts. So just for some context, the average residential system in Connecticut is about 10 kilowatts, so 25 is fairly large. The tariff or the compensation under this program actually lasts for 20 years. So if you install a system, you will receive compensation for the output of your system for 20 years. And there's actually 2 different offerings under the program. Like I mentioned earlier, the legacy programs had there's 2 different programs. One provided compensation for energy, one provided compensation for the renewable energy attributes. The new program provides compensation together for both attributes, and there's 2 different options for how you're compensated for that. The first is a netting tariff, which is very similar, actually currently in place. It's financially essentially equivalent to legacy net metering. The key difference is instead of getting kilowatt hour credits on your bill for any excess generation that your solar project produces, you actually get monetary credits, which are financially equivalent to those kilowatt hour credits, or a buy-all, which gives you a fixed compensation rate for the entire 20-year term of the project. Next slide, please. Great. So I promised to give some context on the program, and what we try to do with all of our proceedings at PURA or any programs that we design or administer, we try to start the design process and the overview process with clear objectives that are vetted with stakeholders in our process. So many of you on the line, and certainly Green Bank folks, are familiar with the process that we went through to set up the RRES program, which started back in 2020. And we landed on in that process as a group and was issued through a formal PURA decision, these 5 objectives for the RRES program. And the first, very importantly, was to maintain at least the historical average deployment of residential solar in Connecticut, which has been roughly 50 to 60 megawatts per year. And we'll talk a little bit more about deployment to date in a little bit. The second interrelated objective was to make sure that this program is helping the state achieve and it stays on a path to achieve 100% zero carbon grid by 2040, including potentially hitting that goal even sooner with the help of this program. The third objective is also to make sure there's, of course, participants in this program, and there's also individuals that are not going to be able to participate in this program. So we want to make sure we're balancing the cost and benefits of this program for both types of customers. And the last 2 objectives are really about accessibility, inclusivity, and equity. So you'll see the first of the last 2 there, objective number 4, is to ensure program accessibility. and also to think about and ensure consumer protections, particularly when we're talking about making sure we're deploying systems in underserved communities. We want to do that in a way that's not making sure that those customers are not being taken advantage of. And one of the ways we can do that is by ensuring a simple program design so that it's not overly complex and complicated. Certainly these things can be even to those of us that are expert in this area. And then the last objective is to make sure that we're maintaining and in fact, increasing inclusivity in program participation, really with a mind towards low to moderate income customer participation in the state. Next slide, please. Great. So I want to tackle two things with this slide. I first want to talk about the rates and how projects are compensated under the RES program, but I also want to talk about the equity provisions that are included in the program, particularly talking about financial adders or compensation adders that are included in the program. So as I mentioned earlier, there are two different types of offerings under this program. The first is the buy-all, which again is a set rate that the project will get for 20 years from the date that it comes in service. So right now, if you install a system under the RES program in 2023, the system will receive 29.43 cents for every kilowatt hour that's produced for 20 years in both Eversource and UI territories. If you decide to go under the netting tariff, again, the energy portion will be compensated at essentially under a netting tariff. What I mentioned earlier is like legacy net metering, which means that you're just offsetting your usage. So when you use the solar behind the meter, you're essentially avoiding your full retail electric rate. And then when you export to the grid, you're currently compensated at the same rate. So essentially your energy compensation is the same rate you're charged for electricity currently from either Eversource or United Illuminating. Because the rates between Eversource and UI were slightly different when we set the rates for our RES projects, we actually set the rate for the REC, or the renewable energy attributes or renewable energy certificate, to be slightly different between the two service territories. So as you can see, there is no extra adder for the REC for projects deployed in UI, whereas there's about a 3-cent adder to the RECs in Eversource territory. And the idea when we set the rates, actually about 2 years ago now, was to try and make the compensation rates the same, or the amount, the total expected compensation over the 20-year period to be the same for all projects, regardless of whether or not you're in Eversource's territory or UI's territory, and even regardless of whether or not you select the netting tariff or the buy-all tariff. So getting into those incentive adders, again, just a reminder at the top of the slide there, objective number 5 in the RES program is to increase inclusivity in LMI, or low to moderate income customer participation. So in order to achieve that, there's really two things I want to talk about. I already mentioned the adders. One is for low income customers, so which is defined as any customer that is 60% or below the state median income. They're eligible for the low income adder, or anyone that lives in a distressed municipality. And there's a list that the Department of Economic and Community Development creates every year. So for any customer that lives in those municipalities that are identified in that list, you would receive that adder. So those adders, of course, the idea there is to encourage increased deployment amongst low-income customers in those specific municipalities. And then the other thing I want to mention is that, and what's really important about the buy-all rate, we think there was an important design consideration when the program was first implemented that allows for customers that take service under the buy-all rate to actually allow for the compensation that is provided for that project to go directly to a third party and not to the customer. And why that matters is because, as some of you on the line might be familiar, there has historically been some issues in deploying solar in low-income areas because of the credit rating scores associated with those customers. What this product does is allows for the utility essentially to be the off taker instead of the customer themselves. And that allows for essentially the credit rating to not be an issue because the relevant credit rating is actually that of the utility, which I think we all know are highly creditworthy organizations. Next slide. Great. Okay. Another piece that I think is really important to talk about, particularly in the context of this webinar today, is the eligibility of multifamily affordable housing in the RES program. So Public Act 2148, which the General Assembly really spearheaded, but also had the involvement of DEEP, the Green Bank, and PURA, allowed for multifamily affordable housing to be eligible for the RES program, which historically speaking, for those that are familiar, and I'll talk about other programs very briefly at the end of my presentation, multifamily affordable housing is eligible for other programs that the state offers. However, one, those programs are competitive, which means that the lowest price wins. And it also generally has a lower compensation rate, which means it's harder to actually deploy those systems, at least financially, through those programs. So the state felt like it made sense to allow multifamily affordable housing to be eligible for RES, which should help the growth of this market in Connecticut. And to be clear, on the last slide, as I walk through the different adders, multifamily affordable housing is actually eligible for the low-income adder. So they would receive the highest compensation rate under RES. I've also listed here the 3 different types of multifamily affordable housing properties that are eligible. I'm not going to get into the different definitions. For folks that are interested in the precise definitions, I've included in the slide here a link to the program manual, which has details on this. I think what's really important is to highlight Tier 3, which allows for flexibility in identifying different facilities that may actually be defined as multifamily affordable housing, but actually aren't strictly met by the Tier 1 and Tier 2 definitions. Great, next slide. And the one thing, before I move on to the deployment slide, I should also mention too, there's great work being done by an affordable housing subgroup that's led by DEEP, the Green Bank, CHAPA, the Department of Housing, and both Eversource and United Illuminating. They're doing a lot of great work, making sure that there's sensible qualifications and criteria for multifamily affordable housing in the RES program. They then come into the PURA process and provide those recommendations and suggested solutions, and then we adopt them to enable deployment in multifamily affordable housing through that program. So I just wanted to make sure to give a shout out to those folks and the great work that they're doing through the working group. Moving on to the slide that we have up here, want to talk about the success that the program is really enjoyed to date. You'll see that the program obviously started in, as I mentioned earlier, in January of 2022, but it takes a little bit of time to get new customers under the program and to deploy the systems. But we've seen a huge increase in deployment, particularly in the second half of last year and through 2023. Of course, the high electric rates that I'm sure everyone's familiar with in Connecticut have been a part of that story. But to date, we've seen or at least through July of this year, we've seen 128 megawatts deployed total. And just in the first half of this year, so January through June, we saw roughly 70 megawatts, 68 megawatts deployed through this program. So that's not, I want to be very clear, that's not including applications that were received, applications that were accepted or approved. This is actual systems that have been placed in service. And obviously, as our annual target was 50 to 60 megawatts, and this is significantly above what we've seen historically. We're pleased with the success to date, and that really wouldn't be possible without the active developers that we've had in Connecticut, but also the electric utilities teams from both Eversource and United Illuminating that brought this program online and are implementing it every day. So another shout out to them for the great work they've been doing in making sure that systems are being deployed through this program. Next slide. Now, the last thing I wanted to flag, at least when it comes to this program, is our deployment to date, and really breaking it down by the different income tracks. Now, I mentioned earlier the low income adder is 60% or below of state median income. This is broken down a little bit differently. There are some federal guidelines and some other state guidelines actually use 80% of area median income. I'm not going to go through the different distinctions, but that's all to say that I wanted to show historical residential solar deployments in general, under both the legacy programs and currently, broken down by these different income tracks to show you how we're doing to date with those equity goals. And as you can see, really the dotted line kind of shows where deployment really becomes more attributable to the RRES program compared to RSIP and legacy net metering. And you'll see, as I mentioned earlier, great success with deployments. And we've actually seen increased deployments in underserved communities as represented by folks that are below 100% of area median income. But proportionally, we are a Justice 40 state. Our goal, as I mentioned earlier, is to increase inclusivity amongst LMI customers. So that means deploying at least 40% in those communities. So we have a little ways to go in terms of reaching the 40% goal, but certainly we're happy with the success we've seen in terms of increased deployment in those communities. Next slide. Great, and then so the last two slides I want to talk about. As Brian mentioned at the top, really what we're talking about today are programs that are related to the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and Solar for All. And the state does have a community solar program. It's a 6-year program that started in 2020. So we're actually already through 3 or 4 years, depending on how you want to count that. And over the total life, the enabling statutes have enabled 225 megawatts to be selected through the program. Although, what's really important to note is the first 3 years only allow 25 megawatts per year. So you can see on the right-hand side of the slide that through the first 3 years of the program, so the third year of the program was 2022, and that's the program that we have the final kind of data for, a program year that we have the final data for. Essentially all 75 megawatts worth of projects were actually selected. So that's a good sign. Unfortunately, the program started right about when COVID was starting to hit Connecticut, and since then there's of course been supply chain issues and inflation. So really deployment is lagged to date, but we're excited about the amount of projects that have been selected so far. And really importantly here, the last thing I want to highlight on this program is that as a community solar program, there are direct benefits. So it's not just a project in a solar project in the field. There are benefits that go directly to customers. And that's actually under this program in the form of a 2.5 cents credit that goes to customers that's allocated, as you can see here, to low-income customers, low to moderate-income customers, small businesses, and other customers that aren't eligible for RRES, as it's broken out here on the slide. Last slide, please. Great, and I've already alluded to, there's already programs in the state and other programs in the state to help meet our climate goals and to deploy solar and other clean energy facilities, notably the non-residential renewable energy program, as well as grid scale procurements that are run by the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. So I'd be remiss if I didn't mention those. And so far we've deployed close to 0.5 gigawatt of solar through those programs. I've also included some links there that really will give you more information into how we're doing on those programs and meeting our overall climate goals to date. And with that, I'm happy to turn it back to Brian, or turn it over to Sergio to walk through energy storage solutions.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sergio Carrillo. I'm Managing Director of Incentive Programs with the Connecticut Green Bank. And I'm going to give you an overview of the Energy Storage Solutions Program. It's the battery storage program that launched in the state in January of 2022. This program is overseen by Pura, is administered by the Green Bank and the utilities, Eversource and United Illuminating, and it's paid for by ratepayers. Next slide, please. So the program has been in the making for a few years. Back in October, just a quick timeline of what has happened. Back in October of 2019, Pura opened the docket 17-1203, reopener 03 as part of their grid modernization docket. In June of 2020, we commissioned Guidehouse to conduct a customer survey to help us in the design of a program, of a battery storage program. And that's important, and I'm going to use some of the material from Guidehouse to explain, how that helped us in the program design. In July of 2020, the Green Bank submitted its solarized storage proposal. It was a proposal for 50 megawatt of residential battery storage, behind the meter battery storage. So it's 50 megawatts. That's important. Then later in mid 2021, Governor Lamont enacted Public Act 2153, and that established a goal of 1,000 megawatts of battery deployment in the state by 2030. Following the enactment of Public Act 2153, Pura issued a final decision in that docket 17-1203, reopener 03, and issued a final decision in December of 2021, making the Connecticut Green Bank a co-administrator of the program along with the utilities. The program launched in 2022 and started accepting applications. There is an annual program review that runs roughly between August and December of each year. So the year 2 review happened last year, and we are right now in the middle of the review process, with a final decision expected in late November of this year. All those changes, to the program that are approved by Pura, will be effective January 1st of 2024. Next slide, please. So I wanted to go back to the research from Guidehouse. There are a few key pieces in that research, and one of the questions, Guidehouse surveyed a subset of customers that were participating in RCIP, customers that already had solar PV installed in their homes. And so you can see here, I think roughly 80% of respondents said that, yes, they would be interested in pairing a battery storage to their solar PV systems. So the interest in is there in the market. Next slide, please. The other question was why, what's preventing you from purchasing a battery? And 67 of respondents said it's too expensive. It's an important piece of information here that helps us in the design of the program. 48, almost half of the respondents said they were waiting for incentives. Next slide, please. And then I think one of the keys, probably the most important piece of information that we got from this survey was what we call the willingness to pay. The question from Guidehouse was, if you have, I'm on the right-hand side of the slide, the question was, if you had to pay $10,000 out of pocket to purchase a battery, would you do it? And you can see roughly 1% of the respondents responded affirmatively. And then they kept reducing that amount. What about $9,000 out of pocket? only 5% would acquire a battery. They kept reducing that amount down to $1,000. What if the out-of-pocket expense is $1,000? You can see the average is around 40%. 40% respondents said yes. You can see there are two lines. What the green line represents LMI, low and moderate income respondents. But all these pieces combined help us understand that having an upfront incentive to lower the installation cost of the battery was going to be a fundamental piece in the program design, and that's how we designed our program. Next slide, please. All right, so as I said, PURA approved, made a final decision in the docket, and they had some priorities, right, that were the fundamental guidelines for us to put together the program. One was that very consistent, by the way, all these priorities or objectives are very consistent with the RS program that Josh just mentioned. One was that the program had to be designed in a cost-effective way. I mean, the benefits of the program had to exceed the cost of administering the program. The second one was that the program had to include or had to ensure participation of vulnerable communities. As Josh mentioned briefly, Connecticut is a Justice 40 state, and 40% of the residential installations had to be in vulnerable communities. The third objective was resiliency. The batteries would have to improve the overall resilience of all participants and the grid as a whole. And this is what's going to generate some of the benefits, of most of the benefits that are going to then pay for the costs of administering the program. And there was an economic development objective. It had to foster the sustained orderly development of a local battery storage industry in the state. Next slide, please. So as I said, PURA approved the program aimed at deploying 580 megawatts of battery storage behind the meter battery storage. There is a split 50-50 between residential and commercial and industrial customers. Just to put it in perspective, for the residential portion, 290 megawatts, it's roughly 30,000 homes, 30,000 systems. So it's quite a significant amount of the systems that we're going to deploy. We're going to try to deploy by 2030. Next slide, please. Some of the program, and this is a little bit too heavy, this slide, but I'll be very brief to say that under the residential portion of the program, we have three customer classes: standard, the underserved communities as defined by the Department of Economic Community Development, and the low-income households, similar to what Josh just explained, these households under 60% state median income. And then there is a component, a commercial and industrial component. They have three customer classes: small, medium, large, based on the customer's peak demand throughout the year. And what is important here, just to summarize this table, is that the program offers two types of incentives. There is an upfront incentive that is paid, administered by the Connecticut Green Bank, for which the batteries are expected to participate in a passive dispatch, what we're calling passive dispatch. And you can see there, the months that dispatch entails is June, July, August, etc., for 5 hours every day. And then there is a second incentive, which is a performance-based incentive that will be administered by the utilities. It will be paid out for 10 years, meaning the batteries are expected to participate in the program for 10 years. And in exchange for those performance incentives, batteries will need to participate in active dispatch events. Active dispatch events override upfront override the passive dispatch events, meaning that any given day there will be either or of these events, but not both will be called. Next slide, please. And these are the residential incentive levels. We had originally designed a declining block structure, right? As we keep deploying more and more batteries, then the incentives, the upfront incentive will start declining in time. And you can see for a standard customer how those incentives will drop from $200 per kWh all the way to 130 kWh. For underserved, it would be 1.5 times the standard incentive, starting at $300 per kWh. And low-income families would be 2 times the incentive of a standard customer, starting at $400 per kWh. With a declining block structure, that was at least in the first year of the program. Then to respond to market conditions and to what we were seeing in the program, we decided to remove the drop down, the step down incentives for underserved and low income customers. So we kept them flat at $300 and $400 per kWh for the first 50 megawatts of capacity. Then on the performance incentive side, you can see that for the first 5 years, a battery can earn up to $225 per kW. And then from year 6 to 10, that compensation would drop to roughly $130 per kW. Next slide, please. Oh, by the way, I must say, so as I showed at the beginning of the presentation, we are in the middle of the annual review process. So these incentives levels may change depending on Pure's final decision that is expected in late July. But as of today, those are the incentives levels. On the CNI side, you can see that it's the same structure, an upfront and a performance incentive. The upfront incentives, however, are much slower on a dollar per kWh, and you can see it's depending on the customer class, small, medium, and large. Large systems receiving the lowest incentives. And then on the performance incentive, from a performance incentive perspective, it's exactly the same as residential. When we put that energy that the batteries discharge back onto the grid, it doesn't matter where it comes from. If it's from a residential or a CNI customer, they're compensated equally. Next slide, please. This is just a summary of the changes from year 1 to year 2 of the program. Those that relate to residential installations is number 2, the low income and underserved upfront incentives. As I mentioned, we removed the declining block structure and kept those upfront incentives flat for the first 50 megawatts of the program. And their dispatch mode, the number 4, that is very important, is that originally, or in year 1, the batteries were expected to participate in both passive and active dispatches. However, in year 2, we allowed for customers to decide whether they wanted to participate in active-only customers. This is related to one very large manufacturer of batteries in the state that in the country that is missing in the program, and I'm talking about Tesla specifically. They wanted to see an active-only mode to participate in the program. We allowed them to do that, and we are in conversations with them. So I'm hopeful that that they will join the program soon. And then the 5th one, and Josh mentioned this, it was the treatment of multifamily affordable housing that was initially treated as commercial customers. But the decision in the RS docket was also made possible in the ESS program. And now we're treating multifamily affordable housing as residential customers. which makes them eligible to much larger upfront incentives. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to invite you to visit our program website. It's energystoragect.com. And there you will find all the resources you need to get started to learn more about the program, about the incentive levels, the commitment from the batteries. You're going to see a list of installers that can help you navigate the application process and the installation process for the incentives and with the utilities, etc. They're going to guide you through the process so that it will be almost transparent to you as a customer. And I think that is my last slide. Thank you.
All right, Josh, Sergio, thank you for that comprehensive overview of the Residential Renewable Energy Solutions Program and the Energy Storage Solutions Program. Thank you for that. So just a few closing thoughts before we get to Q&A. Let's go to the next slide, Rudy. So first of all, this is the fourth of a series of webinars that we've had. We've also done some storyboards on the first three webinars that lay out a lot of detail, linking to reports, linking to calculations, linking to policies, really providing additional information in terms of what's happening. So in that first webinar on residential solar investment program and the incentive program that Connecticut had from 2012 through 2022, we help readers understand how to think about the market potential. You know, when you're looking at single family, multifamily owners versus renters, how do you wrap your arms around the market? We help the readers understand solar potential. How could you actually estimate the technical and economic potential of your market? And then we provided an overview of the incentive program. So dig in there, really cool storyboard. Then the second webinar, we then got into loans. So in the storyboard, you're going to find a lot of information around how to calculate a levelized cost of energy. A bit wonky, but it's really important when you think about the solar for all applications that you're going to be submitting. How do you compare and compute your household savings? LCOE is one way of doing it. We talk a lot about electricity rates over time in our 2 utility service territories. So we show a lot of graphics showing that gradual increase over time. And then we delved really deeply into loans and the loan programs that we offered, showing the impacts of principal and interest, terms of the loans on the levelized cost of energy. So really something for folks to dig into in terms of financial assistance, how that can enable greater access to residential solar by reducing the overall levelized cost of energy. And then the third webinar, we dug into the importance of power purchase agreements and leases. We also showed how those PPA rates and lease rates compare to electricity rates. What's the delta? Again, when you're looking at your meaningful benefits, this is part of our Solar for All jargon, household savings of 20%, how do you get there? You want to look at your lease and PPA rates and compare those to electricity rates, and that will help you calculate it. So definitely dig in. There's lots of really interesting things going on there in those, not only the webinars, you can watch the past webinars if you haven't seen them, but dig into the storyboards. Let's go forward. There you go, right there. All right. So I wanted to leave you with a few final points. One is this slide here. You know, I started off with the importance of the Inflation Reduction Act having passed a year ago. So I want to talk about how solar, specifically residential solar, through financing, in this case by Posigen through its lease offering, actually helps low-income families navigate inflation. So the top image that we're seeing here, the dark blue line, are essentially electric rates over time. What you can see happen in 2023 is that that electric rate increased by 12 cents per kilowatt hour. A fundamental foundational reason for that was the war in the Ukraine. Connecticut has an over-reliance on natural gas within our electric system. So the standard offer was susceptible to that, and therefore all ratepayers that were on the standard offer saw a 12-cent increase in the supply of electricity. So taking them from 25 cents per kilowatt hour to 37 cents. So imagine what that does to families, specifically low-income families and those that live in disadvantaged communities, when they've actually had nothing to do with it. You had an external market factor that impacted electric rates. Now they have to manage the day-to-day. So you saw that significant 50% roughly increase in their electric rates over that period of time. The light blue line is actually how the residential solar projects underneath PosiGen. We had about 4,500 residential solar customers. We collect data on them. We know how much those systems are producing. We know what their monthly lease rate is. So we could actually compute a lease rate, the amount of kilowatt hours produced and what their monthly rate is, to get to a comparative against electricity rates. What you see here is that as electricity rates rose significantly, solar actually helped those families hedge off the complete inflationary pressure of those electric rate increases. Let's go to hit the button once more, Rudy. So this here is the cumulative savings for all 4,500 customers of PosiGen over time. A couple of interesting things you can see here. You can see over time, gradually, the cumulative savings increasing. Think about the portfolio of customers that are coming online through PosiGen. This is a steady ramp up and steady growth. We stopped at about 4,500 customers in 2022. So what's interesting here is that you could actually see in the first 6 months of this year, when those inflationary pressures hit them, that their solar PV systems actually allowed them to hedge all of that off. So within 6 months, they saved $4 million in overall, cumulatively, about $900 per family, only through those first 6 months. So this is at the foundation of the Inflation Reduction Act, right? How do you help enable access to residential solar for low-income and disadvantaged communities so they can increase their household savings as a result of? Obviously, we want to also see them increase their resilience, which is why Sergio and Josh were talking about our 2 incentive programs and how we could bring those things together so that in the event the grid goes out, we have the batteries that can kick in and provide more resilience to low-income and disadvantaged communities. All right, let's go to one last slide. I think this is the Bidenomics slide. Yeah, so I wanted to bring it back to the importance of the Inflation Reduction Act. We've been talking a lot about the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and Solar for All, but there are other provisions within the Inflation Reduction Act that incentivize low-income deployment of solar, specifically in energy communities. We have many of them here in the state of Connecticut. This was an event that was held at PosiGen's headquarters in New Orleans, Louisiana, where Treasurer Yellen announced this is where they came out on Bidenomics. And it was specifically important for them to do it at PosiGen. That is Ben Healy, the CEO of PosiGen, introducing Treasurer Yellen there. For those of you who know, Ben used to work here at the Connecticut Green Bank. We're excited to see him now leading the charge at PosiGen with all their crews. But this is all to simply say that by providing access to the benefits of residential solar, we can actually help our most vulnerable citizens navigate the inflationary pressures that they've absolutely had no reason to have impacted, to now benefit from these technologies. So just wanted to stop there with that final point on the importance of the Inflation Reduction Act, tax credits, Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. We are less than a month away from the deadline on the applications. And why don't we stop there and have Sergio and Josh come back up and we'll take questions.
Excellent, Brian. Thank you. Thanks, Sergio and Josh, for a lot of information there. And we've actually had a lot of questions come in, and given the short amount of time that we have left, I'm going to try to pick a couple. And as I said, we will do our best to follow up with folks individually after the fact to try to answer some of these questions for you. So the first question that came in is the netting rec available to multifamily buildings? And specifically, could they put the solar behind the meter?
Yeah, good question. So under the RES multifamily affordable housing part of the program, it's just the buy-all. And so that means that systems, well, it depends on your definition of behind the meter, but systems are typically connected in front of their typical utility meter, but then electrically from a physics perspective, the electrons still go to the facility. And so to answer the REC question, that compensation, the buy-all rate is both energy and REC, so it's one bundled rate, but then you do get the low income adder.
Okay, perfect. So a question, Brian, on Solar for All itself. Is it your understanding that a performance-based incentive funded by Solar for All could only be offered during the 5-year performance period?
Oh, great question. Great technical question. I would say like submit that into the EPA for their response. What the question person is asking is essentially the performance period for Solar for All. All of those who are competing and submitting are required to think about a 5-year performance period. So starting, let's say, July 1st of next year for 5 years, how are you applying your financial assistance and technical assistance to support the market? You're within a 5-year period. I would say ask that question to the EPA because I wouldn't want to be wrong. Just in relation to Connecticut, as an example, Josh, talked about a 20-year tariff rate, right? So our incentives go through a 20-year period. Sergio talked about the performance incentive under energy storage solutions going through 10 years. So yes, local incentive programs, performance-based incentive programs may be different than how they're lined up nationally, but ask that question of EPA. You've got less than 30 days to find your answer.
Thanks, Brian. A question about RES. Is there any thought on increasing the cap sizes on RES given the push for electrification of homes?
Yeah, great question on electrification. So two answers to that. On the 25 kilowatt threshold, I believe that's in statute. So we'd have to go to the legislature to ask for that. So certainly something that could be considered during next legislative session. But in terms of making sure that we're coordinating with our other state policies, including encouraging beneficial electrification, there is a specific provision in the RES statute 16244Z for those that want to read at home that requires the project be sized to load. And so we made sure that there are provisions to allow for both fuel switching and the addition of EV chargers when you're sizing your system to load. So we don't want to be in a situation where you're sizing a project based on your current load and then you're planning on adding 2 EVs and then you're asking later to add on the system. We understand that that's inconvenient for customers. You should do that all at once. And so there are provisions to address that. But again, the 25 kilowatts is a statutory requirement.
Great, thank you, Josh. So one final question, I think this one might be one for Sergio. It's actually about battery safety in multifamily. Is there safety concerns that the asker is wondering about, a 5+ unit building, is there concerns about fire safety, or should it be installed in a garage or somewhere away from the building? What are your thoughts on battery safety and installation?
Yeah, that's a good question. But as part of safety is an important aspect of the program, right? And to ensure the safety of battery owners, we are requesting some certifications, including 9540, which is the one that tests for fire. And one requirement is that the batteries meet all the safety standards that are used in the US and in the world. So from that perspective, I think we are covered. From an installation perspective, I think that's different. That's a code, the code standards that dictate where batteries can and cannot be installed. And from that perspective, I think municipalities and towns will have the responsibility to ensure that the batteries are installed in a safety manner. Brian, I don't know if you, or Josh, if you want to add some to that.
All right, well, since we're at 1:03, I think this is a perfect place to wrap up. As I said, thank you to our presenters today. Thank you all for attending this webinar. The recording and slides will be sent out later this week, and we will do our best to answer some of these questions that we didn't get to. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.